Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, the hidden lives of beluga whales, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Kristina Disney. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Kristina, take it away.
Thank you so much, Rob, and thank you everyone who is tuning in for part two. If you were with us for part one, we talked about a lot of different things. Mostly, we spent actually a lot of time talking about what it means for a whale to be able to dive. So we were talking about um, our mammalian dive reflex, which is something that we share in common with our beluga friends. All mammals have the capacity. It's hardwired into our nervous system, different nerves in our face, our capacity to slow down our breathing, slow down our heart rate, things like that. And so we were talking about these really intrinsic components of what it means to be a mammal and how specifically beluga whales, but lots of marine mammals have manipulated those to live in this wild environment. You know, for you and I, every breath we do is while we're doing something else. Whereas if you're a whale, everything you do is in between your breaths, right? Their time at the surface are just these simple windows of time, not even moments of respite. We kind of think of it that way because we're these air breathing terrestrial animals where they come to the surface for a break, but they come to a surface for a breath and then they go back underneath, right? They go back under to sleep, to play, to feed, all of those things. And so kind of a big theme that we were talking about last time was how there's these feedback loops and how climate change and things like that come into play with it. And so one of the things we were talking about, we got really nitty gritty. If anyone wants to go back for it, if you weren't with us for part one, we got really nitty gritty into what happens to your hemoglobin and your hematocrit in your body. So essentially what's happening for your red blood cells, because that's how much oxygen you can carry. And there was a really cool study that came out a couple years ago that was showing that belugas, as they are having complications reaching prey, different sources like that, as their habitat is changing, they're not growing quite as large. And with that, because they have a smaller body mass, they actually have a reduced concentration of that hemoglobin, so of that capacity to hang on to oxygen in their cells. And so they were finding that with every increase in body size of about 10% of their body mass, they lost 1 minute in diving time, which is a lot. That's a huge amount, right? If your average dive time is 10 minutes, you do most of your foraging and your playing in sort of these 4 6 minute bouts. If you do really longer dives, maybe for scouting, maybe for finding different breathing holes that can go up to 20, the longest recorded one was around 23 minutes, right? So a minute or two makes a big difference in the extent of your world. And that's kind of what I was really trying to drive home in part one for folks, was just that the parameters of their world are really driven by their diving, by how that happens, right? And for us, we don't think about that. We can always sort of freely move around in our environment. There's not very many places, thankfully, on Earth that we have trouble breathing, right? And so that means that we just kind of move freely. You don't have to time you're not timing your movements with your breath. Although we all should be. We should all be better yogis and timing everything we do with our breath. But that's an aside. So for those who missed part one, that's kind of a recap. For those who are there, hopefully that kind of jogged your memory on what we talked about. And like I said, we're going to do multiple parts of this. This is going to be part two. So each one is going to have a little bit of a different theme and hopefully cover a different aspect of what life is like below the surface, right? And so our hidden lives of belugas, it's really about being more than just underwater, right? That layer of ice, whatever the condition it might be, really contains the scope of their world. It's not like in the same way I was making the comment, we need to breathe and we take every step. They don't just get to come up at every breath that they would like to, right? That sea ice is the cap on their world, and it's only in either held open holes like leads or polonias that they can come up and breathe in the wintertime. In the summertime, it's a different story because all that sea ice retreats over the poles and they have a bit more free flow. So what I want to talk about today is how both the quantity, so how much area they have, and the quality of their habitat is actually driven by the rivers that flow into the Arctic. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to the Pan-Arctic Drainage Basin. So it's probably not the way that a lot of us see or think about the world, right? We see it in geographical boundaries of countries and provinces and states. We see it often projected to us, with North America at the center or with the equator and everything else wrapped around it. So I find even just it's really refreshing to just look at the world from the top down, right? Change your perspective of how you're connected to one another and who's connected to one another, right? We often feel so far away from our Asian and European counterparts, but if you go north, we're really not all that far apart, and we're all feeding into the same Arctic Ocean. So these are the major river basins that feed into the Arctic on the Asian and European side. So, sorry, if we start on the down the European, right? So kind of like into Scandinavia and in the top part of Russia here, right? We're getting into the Cervenia Dvana, the Petrokora, the Ob, the Yenisei, the Lena, the Kolyma, and then we go on the North American side. I've put a red star here so you can see where Churchill is in Hudson's Bay. And they've just sort of, for this study, they've identified it majorly as the Nelson, but there's lots of rivers. And this is true for the whole Pan-Arctic. There are lots of smaller rivers. These are the largest contributors, which is why they've been identified here. So kind of the Nelson flowing in there. And then we also have the Mackenzie, which is a massive one. And then the Yukon we still count it because a lot of that outflow still goes Arctic, but it actually kind of is just outside of the fingers where Russia and Alaska almost connect. But we still consider it as part of the Pan-Arctic Trade Basin because a lot of that water still filters into our Arctic Ocean. So this was looking at the individual rivers, and then they kind of, in this study, they grouped them by Eurasian, so combining Europe and Asia together, and they grouped them by the North American ones. And classically, maybe for me, before we talk about the knowledge that's in this graph, I just have to pick it apart. This thing drives me insane. So often you can do really good science, but if you do bad science communication, it leads to a breakdown in trust. And it starts with little things like this. And anyone else who's staring at this, if it's bothered you, it's bothered me from the moment I looked at it. The way we present knowledge matters, and humans we're pattern recognition. And so what these folks in this study have done, which is arguably harmless when they're thinking about it, because they think about it very intuitively, but for someone else who's looking at it, is that they change the scales on this. So the Eurasian is in red, and that scale is on the left-hand axis, and the North American scale is on the right-hand axis. And those are not the same. They shouldn't have done that because it makes it look like the two of those are the same, when really they've stretched out that 1,500 to 1,000 range and blown it up. And they're trying to do it for a means of comparison. Like, I can understand this as another scientist, why they did it. But the problem is that on a cursory glance, it makes the two look very comparable. What you really need to take away from this is that most of the water in our Arctic Ocean, a lot of it is coming from the Eurasian side. Far less of it comes from the North American side. But when you look at this graph at the offset, that is not what your brain tells you, right? Our brains are pictogram readers. We look at numbers and things like that only secondary. So anyways, this is me of a bit of a rant, but just to throw some numbers behind this. So Asia for the Arctic Ocean has about 55% of the flow. Europe has about 30%, and then North America actually has around 15, 17%. So just to kind of scale that in your head a little bit. Now, it's not just, when we think about that, those rivers, when they come in, that's like, for lack of a better word, the climate control of the Arctic Ocean. So what I mean by that is that it's not just the amount of water that it's controlling, it's also controlling a lot of the habitats and the features. So when we're looking at this here, all of that fresh water is flowing into the ocean, and it actually leads to the Arctic Ocean being one of the most, or least salty, it's a better way to say it, least salty oceans on the globe. So this is a heat map, which just means it's just visually showing you from red to blue who has the most salt and who has the least salt. So in case you've ever wondered this, right, the Arctic, again, because you'd think with all that sea ice maybe that it would be salty, or some part of your brain might go in that direction because as the ice comes out, it makes the water saltier. But because there's so much water coming in from those rivers, that actually it still stays much, much fresher than a lot of the other coasts, right? So you can kind of see in here that it's actually more equatorial and kind of that Atlantic, North Atlantic, South Atlantic, really where we have quite salty water. Now, that fresh water, when it flows into the Arctic Ocean, The other thing that's really important to consider is where does it go once it gets there, right? I know we always say we have different oceans, but again, it's one ocean, one earth, one water. But how easily those move through each other is kind of how we decide which one is an ocean basin and which one it's not, right? So it's a little more obvious, I shouldn't say this, when you have a whole continent, right? And here we have a collection of continents that kind of hold it together and sort of trap it in there. And so this is what we're looking sort of down on that. And that dark blue is the deepest. And what I really want you to notice here is that like our greens and browns is our terrestrial, but the majority of the Arctic Ocean is really quite shallow, like in around all those continents. We call it a continental shelf, right? Because those rivers are depositing lots of sediment and they're infilling it over time. It's another thing to think about. I find that this is like if you're a map person, this is a good way to think about it, but sort of a bit more 3D way to look at the Arctic Ocean basin. So it's a bit harder because the blue now is just showing you the really deep part, but you can see where land is kind of in that darker brown, and then where you see that sort of tan and light, that's where sediment is just settling, coming out of all these rivers. So now you get a sense of like there's really very shallow oceans, and then there's this deep basin that kind of carves through the middle. And so it holds, kind of what I was saying before, it holds that water. Sorry, I got a little bit of a cold coming out, or getting over, I should say. It holds that water like a basket up there. And water does exchange in and out of it, but it actually can spend quite a long time sort of stuck in the basin and only the top spills over. So you could almost think about it like a natural weir or even a dam sort of, where like the main basin stays the same and the top water kind of flows past. And eventually it all does cycle through, but it changes something what we call residence time. And so residence time is really important because that determines how oxygen and nutrients and all of that good stuff that keeps life flowing and going cycles through a place. So that's kind of our continental basket, or continental shelf basket, holding it all together. I almost said continental breakfast there, which I was laughing a little bit to myself. So speaking of breakfast, speaking of food, this next map. So I said that that's how the basket is holding all of our water up in the Arctic, kind of held between all of the continents coming in on each other. And so if we now just take a look at where do we have the most abundance in the Arctic? Where is the most life? And that's a kind of usually a hard question. It's a hard way to bear down and figure out. So we often go down to like the most base form of life. So we also go down to photosynthesis. Where do we have the most photosynthesis? Because wherever we have that is where we're going to have all of our food webs and our food chains rise up from that. And so on this graph, this is showing you primary production. They can do it lots of different ways. One of the ways they do it is they measure the way that chlorophyll takes in light. That's the pigment when light hits a plant leaf or hits a little hunk of pretty algae or diatom, right? It's the way that light reflects back. So it's a massive way that we can sort of do photosynthesis with that. So pink is not a lot, very little life going on, and then going into reds is where we've got it going. And hopefully, even though we're not looking at it in the same way, you'll notice that a lot of our reds come from where our oceans are. The exception being sort of this Atlantic side in here where we've got nutrients coming up from the south. But otherwise, the rest of the rim here is all correlated to where the rivers are coming in, right? So if we go back to this graph that I don't really like, right? It's showing that we're having since kind of like 1930s, give or take a little bit, or essentially over the 1900s, let's just say it that way, for both the North American and Eurasian sides, we're seeing an increase in discharge from the river. We're seeing more water come out of those rivers. And with that, we're not just seeing more water, we're seeing more sediments getting washed out, and we're seeing more nutrients arrive in the river basin. And so, again, if we take a look at those subbasins, and so this is now looking at it from the ocean's perspective rather than the river's perspective. So what I mean by that is if you look at the colored polygons in the map over there, each one of those is a different sea within the Arctic Ocean. And then it is showing you the rivers that like the major rivers that are flowing in there. So it's showing you 6 of those. But what the graph is showing you on the right side here, again, we're looking at primary production, and this is a model. This hasn't happened yet, but what they did was they said, what would happen if the rivers flowing into the Arctic were to double the amount of water going in, right? And what this is showing you is that it would have effects, it would increase the amount of our net primary productivity. So it would increase the amount of food availability, and it would go up and up and up, right? And so what you might think, and what that kind of indicates off the get-go, is that we would see a tipping of the scales, right? And we would see a shift in an ecosystem as these paradigms start to reshuffle. And for our belugas, what could and does that shift mean? We already can see that these rivers are increasing in flow. So this is already happening. How far they'll get to, we still don't quite know, on how those paradigms will change, but we already know we're getting more fresh water brought into the Arctic Ocean, and with it, it's bringing more sediment and more nutrients. So now, if we kind of compare where the nutrient loading is coming from, and if we compare that to where do our belugas live, we look at this map from WWF here. It's showing you two things. So you can see, I just have to zoom in. There we go. So the hashed line is summer grounds, and then you would be able to see all annual is in yellow. So you can see where that overlap happens. Some places, they spend their whole lives there. Sometimes they go and come back seasonally, give or take a little bit. Sorry, just one sec. So you might think when you look at this right off the get-go, well, hey, look, this is great. Look at where we're going to have more food available for our belugas. And look at where they're living. This is going to line up super well. This is awesome for belugas. Well, rarely in any ecosystem is 1 + 1 = 2, right? Rather than thinking about the image of the scales tipping and the balance going in this lovely, simple dichotomy, I like to think about those games that you had as kids where you'd like put a marble in one spot and you had no idea where it was going to pop out at later. That's more like ecological balance. That is more like the tenuous, very complicated relationships that are rolling through the Arctic as we speak, as we try to figure out how this shakedown is going to go. So let's talk about why. So far, I've been talking about an aquatic ecosystem in the Arctic, but another really important thing to think about is that our permafrost, so our terrestrial Arctic ecosystem, is drastically changing right now. We're seeing a lot of melting, we're seeing lots of erosion, and that means different things in different places, right? I think this is just a nice image. I mean, I could have showed you a map or whatever, but it's just kind of interesting to see. Here is how a lot of subsurface in the Arctic looks, right? You can see that there is both high and low ice content in the soil. Some places have bigger than others. You can see the really dramatic difference between what's the active layer. So that's where plants are actually growing within a seasonal cycle, and permafrost, which is like we do not thaw, right? And so that active layer is increasing. And from a river sense, from a river point of view, we can see that it is like that's what's getting eroded away, right? So yes, there is definitely still more anthropogenic influxes coming in. Some of those spaces are not highly what am I trying to say? They don't have a high urban population or anything like that, but some of them do, and it feeds into larger systems because those are massive. Like those are massive, massive rivers that I'm talking about, right? They literally drain, a third of a continent in some way. So they're connected to a lot of different systems. So some of that is, these human released nutrients, but a lot of it is just the ecosystem is releasing material and sending it downstream. And so the Arctic Ocean is extremely sensitive to this, right? It's changing the biogeochemistry of the ecosystem. It's changing how light is entering the ocean, and that changes then all of photosynthesis, right? So it's like, hey, we're getting more nutrients, but also we're getting more cloudy. So then there's not the energy for the photosynthesizers to even use it. It is not a straight and narrow relationship by any means. And on top of it, when we are thinking about, so now again, I've sort of brought in the terrestrial scope. Now let's bring in the ice side of things. So this is a map showing you we've got our beluga populations, we've got our changing primary productivity, and in the middle we've got what is both historic and projected circumference, reach, whatever you want to call it, of sea ice, right? And how that's shrinking and shrinking. And so the nutrients, as they flow in, are at the mouths of the river. Now, sea ice, when we often think about it, if you do think about it, I don't know if anyone thinks about it as much as I do. I should probably think about some other stuff sometimes. Obsessive thoughts are what they are when you love the Arctic. This is what comes to mind. You might even plop a polar bear into your image of what you're imagining. And if you're not thinking about sea ice as often as I am, maybe it's just a hot summer day and you're thinking about the ice that's going to go into your sweet tea or something like that. Well, this is how we imagine ice. I want to take you on a bit of a journey, and I want you to introduce you to sea ice at the microscopic level. Sea ice is not solid, right? Even freshwater ice is not solid, but that's more air bubbles trapping. Sea ice is not solid because as those salt crystals, so you can imagine like water is all these molecules got its arms, and as it freezes, it pushes out. So kind of like a mosh pit in there. It pushes out the salt molecules out of its lattice so that it can freeze. And when it does so, it creates these channels of really salty water. And that gets pushed out and that goes down, and then the ice sort of freezes more at the top. So if you do have sea ice, the top is the most fresh, least amount of salt, and there's actually a mixture of salt still in the ice below because it's so cold it can freeze like that, right? It's cold enough that it can manage that. Now, what's important is that these little channels do not go empty. They are filled with little tiny little organisms. This is where a lot of our photosynthesizers are. A big one being diatoms, right? If you cut into sea ice and even lake ice, you'll ever notice there's kind of that spongy looking stuff at the bottom. That's life. That's life brewing and stewing and keeping our ecosystems alive and thriving. And so phytoplankton colonizes all of these cracks, lives in there, and then what happens is every spring, the reason why literally thousands upon thousands of millions of organisms fly from pole to pole, why humpbacks swim the entire coast of like the continent of North America, why everybody who is who knows books it to the Arctic is for this bloom. They go because as that ice melts, some of that phytoplankton is like prepped and charged to release from the sea ice. And you're looking at a real satellite image here. That's the phytoplankton bloom in the spring over Norway. So all of these animals are flooding there to eat and enjoy that productivity that's being kicked out. And so it bursts upon the world. It's a huge, huge thing. And so when we think about a food chain, we really need to think that that food chain is tied to the ice, right? That's where this whole balance of the ecosystem, it goes off the trends, the ebbs and flows of the ice. That does the phytoplankton, and that trickles then up the whole ecosystem. In this case, we're interested in belugas, so that's how we got the top right now. But what we're seeing is we're starting to see a decoupling of that relationship. And I meant that both, I fully intended that pun. That's what I was trying to say. So we have our river nutrients that are flowing in at the mouths of the river, and we have our sea ice that is retreating more and more to the center. And so just what that means for our system is that we don't really know how these changes are going to rebound through the food web, right? We don't know, maybe it'll be good for some. Actually, sorry, it will 100% be good for some species and bad for others. It will also introduce species that were not here before. They'll start making their way further north because the cold that used to keep them out no longer does. And so these webs are going to change, and the story is going to change. And to be honest, we don't really know how it's going to change, right? That's kind of the big question right now. All of these changes are happening, and we only know that resilience is going down, right? The capacity, if things go too quickly, we don't know what the next path is going to be. We don't know where things are going to go. So we're kind of like Alice in Wonderland. We're standing in front of the tree trying to figure out, at least on the science side, which way are things going to go and how can we help them go in a way that's good not just for us, but all of the lovely creatures that call those places home. So if I bring this back to belugas, again, if you remember from last time, we're talking about who do belugas eat, right? Who is that network that belugas belong to as part of their food web? And so belugas are both bottom feeders as well as pelagic feeders. So benthic, that means that they're eating yummy, yummy things on the bottom, and they're also eating things out of the water column. So when they're on the bottom, they're going for things like bivalves, like mussels and clams and slugs and snails, even the odd octopus or squid if they can get them. But then they also will be hunting in the water column, right? So they're hunting schools of fish, belugas in groups of 4 or 5. They'll kind of herd the fish into a shallow water, and then they'll attack kind of in a bit of a feeding frenzy for as long as they can until the school disperses, and then they'll have to sort of repeat again, either with hopefully the same school or a different school of fish. And a fun one, right, is they don't actually chew their food. They essentially swallow it whole and suck it in. And as far as those fish, these kind of schooling fish, that could be things like capelin, herring, cod, if you're in the right areas of the Arctic, even salmon, flatfish, things like that. So how does, when we think about these changes and sort of where does that fit in, I want to zoom in on sort of that local web. I want to take some time of what it's like here in Hudson's Bay. But before I do, there's something I want to bring up. And I've just spent the last however many minutes or slides talking about how climate change is decoupling these ecosystem relationships between species and how we're not really sure where that's leading to. Or I should say, it's leading to uncertainty. That's the better way to say it. It is leading to uncertainty. It's not that we don't know, it's leading to uncertainty. And so a friend of mine sent me this just last week, and I honestly wasn't sure if it was real. I kind of had to go and look. So this is David Suzuki. I don't know if he's as big in the States as he is in Canada. He's kind of like a pillar of environmentalism, I would say. Everyone knows his name. Even if you don't follow it, you kind of know who he is. And so when my friend sent this to me, I wanted to go read the article for myself because it's kind of, oh, well, it's a lot when someone who is sort of a pillar of an ideology changes their tune and says something that you never would have imagined them saying before. When an icon gives way on their beliefs, you have to really stop and wonder, like, what is going on and how have we gotten here? And so that's what he said in this interview. He said climate change, that the fight against climate change is lost. And so I just want to take a little bit of time here. I'm going to read a little bit of some of the larger interview, and then kind of talk about some of how that fits in and sort of what that's meant for me as I've had to really chew this over the last week or so. So this is directly from him. I believe an informed public will do the right thing. Public concern in the late 1980s was right at the top, and we had the first international conference on the atmosphere in '88, where there were 300 people, 40 governments, environmentalists, scientists, private sector, you name it. At the end of that conference, they said global warming represented a threat to humanity, second only to nuclear war. If the world had followed the conclusion from that conference, we would not have the problem we face today, and we would have saved trillions of dollars and millions of lives. Now it's too late. I've never said that to the media before, but it's too late. I say that because I go by the science of Johan Rostrom, as a Swedish scientist, who heads the Potsdam Institute and has defined these 9 planetary boundaries. So this is what he's talking about when he says 9 planetary boundaries. They're different sectors, and the idea just being that there's essentially thresholds that the Earth is capable of withstanding and functioning within. And this is showing an example from 2009 up to 2023 here about which boundaries we've essentially crossed, right? Which ones are currently running, the Earth is running on an empty tank in that way, right? And we haven't been able to refill it or change it. So this is what sorry, just want to aside that. He says, these are constraints on how we live. As long as humans, like all other animals, live within those 9 constraints, we can do it forever. And that includes the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, the pH of the oceans, the amount of available fresh water, the nitrogen cycle, etc. There are 9 planetary boundaries, and we've only dealt with one of them, the ozone layer, and we think we've saved ourselves from that threat. But we passed the 7th boundary this year, in 2025, and we're in extreme danger. And he says, look, I'm not giving up in the sense of doing nothing, but I'm saying as an environmentalist, we've failed to shift the narrative and we're still caught up in the same legal, economic, and political systems. For me, what we do now is hunker down. The unit of survival are going to be local communities. I'm urging local communities to get together. And I urge you, if you want to go and read the whole thing for yourself, by all means. I just kind of pulled out the parts that really stuck with me. And I think I always think 2 parts. Right? I think the world is also always changing, and I think that the climate is changing. The climate has changed. You don't have to use future tense anymore. I think we're in it. I know where I live, we've had more wildfires and more droughts, and our world is drastically changing. And so the idea that to fight that change, that's not happening. That's over. Right? I can kind of wrap my mind around that, but another thing, I just really, really appreciate that that's where he goes to, that the units of survival are going to be local communities. I'm urging local communities to get together. So for those of you who may or may not know, I do work for Natural Habitat as a guide and a naturalist, but I've also spent the last 4 years of my life running a community monitoring program that's essentially helping this community on Vancouver Island steward their own river. And with that community and in that river, I have left my blood, my sweat, my tears, a good portion of my sanity, trying to make it so that they have some autonomy, so that they can have a choice in a better future for themselves. So they have the tools to make that choice. So it's not just this blindly swept up thing in bureaucracy. And there is a boatload of bureaucracy in the community that I work in. It is not a simple issue. There are many competing interests, and ultimately everyone wants to have, a good life and a safe life. And then how we go about that, it can be complicated. But the point is that the community is making a choice. They're trying to make a choice for the future that they want. And so, again, if I go back to Alice in Wonderland, one day Alice came to a fork in the road and saw the Cheshire Cat in a tree. "Which road do I take?" she asked. "Where do you want to go?" was his response. "I don't know," said Alice. Then said the cat, "It doesn't matter." And so, for anyone who is listening, please pick a road for your community. Make it matter where you end up. Because as long as we're all not sure where we want to go, as long as we don't all start to try and move that dial somewhere in our communities and in the places that we care about, then yeah, we're not going to end up very nice. We're just going to wander like Alice. And I don't really want to be at the whims of the coattails of the White Rabbit or anything like that, right? It's worthwhile, the blood, the sweat, and the tears, whatever it is you put into it. Pick something. It can be, a food bank. It can be environmental. It can be anything, but try to make it better in your community. Try to take care of your community so your community can take care of you. Try to take care of the land so the land can take care of you, right? There are a lot of big sweeping changes out there that we do not have any control of, but you do have a control in how you contribute to your community. So there it is. I couldn't help myself. There's a bit of my soapbox, but I wanted to say it that way because I wanted to then show you an example of what's kind of going on right now. I want to get local in what's going on in Hudson's Bay. So in Hudson's Bay, there's actually, I know it looks pretty empty in this map, but there are a lot of communities that live on that coast, that depend on that coast, both for the aquatic environment and the terrestrial one. And Churchill, where we guide here, is one of them, but there are many more. And so they have been trying to negotiate with the federal government to turn large tracts of Hudson's Bay into what will become a national marine conservation area. And it requires a lot of work, and it requires a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. Cough, cough, hint, hint. But people are trying to move the dial on that and make a difference. And so what I want to share with you is a really cool effort that was done. So multiple communities, but there's a study that focused on 3 spots in Hudson's Bay. And so we've got Churchill, we've got James Bay, and then we also have, on the other side, next to Kuujjuaraq. It'll come to me in just a second. So I just want to share, and sorry, give me 1 second. Apologies. So this was done by National Geographic in 2022 was the kind of when things are starting to come together. But they partnered with National Geographic Pristine Seas, slow down, partnered with 10 different Indigenous governments all across Hudson's Bay, as well as Oceans North and the Government of Canada, to conduct and document, to conduct a scientific essential baseline study, or get a, what am I trying to say? To get an actual idea of what's going on underneath the water. It's because it's establishing some data where we have never had data before. And so they did that on Aravat. There we go. And so that was the other town. So in these 3 places, and it's a really amazing thing because when you go to the Arctic and you go to the subarctic, like when I go up to Churchill, I have seen, at the surface, it's one world, but below the surface, it is a whole other one. And so trying to value that and see the value in that has been really big and really spectacular. So that's why I'm really stoked to share this with you and share where some of that work's going. So a couple things that they did scuba diving transects. So what that looks like is that someone literally goes and dives, and then they have these grids. I've done this terrestrially. I've never done it underwater, but essentially you have grids, and then you will randomly throw them down at different spaces. That's why they've got the dice sort of shown in there to decide at what spacing you'll go at. And then from there, you'll actually count different species that are observed in the transect. So it's one way of counting kind of like what's stationary, right? But obviously our oceans are full of all sorts of animals that are coming and going. And so one really big thing, or something that's gotten really big, I'd say in the last 10 years or so, and it's kind of changing the conservation world dramatically as to what we can know and how we can understand things, something called environmental DNA. So what that means is that, sorry, 1 sec, is that they are able to take little bits of anything from you, cells, feces, skin, cuticles, anything like that. They sort of gets in the water. They can extract out of the water, duplicate the DNA, like not duplicate it as in clone it, but they double down on it, so they then have enough to identify who it came from. And so this is a really amazing way to suddenly be able to see what organisms are passing through. It obviously not all of that tissue is viable. So you usually have a few days, right? So you don't know who was there last month maybe, but you can know what kind of animals have rolled through, often on the scale of days, sometimes longer depending on the environment. Terrestrial environments can be longer than aquatic, but the salt water kind of breaks down the tissue with time. So on our Churchill side of things, this is Churchill down in the bottom left, little tiny Churchill dot, and then they worked on somewhere called Hubbard Point. So a little further north, closer to the mouth of Seal River rather than Churchill River. But they also took some samples in Churchill as well. And what does the world look like below, right? This is classically when we fly out over it. That's what it looks like from above. You can sort of see these streaking waves of sediment going off into the bay. It's a really shallow lowland, often wetlands. But beneath it, they were able to start categorizing what's the environment like under there, right? And keep in mind that this is not your normal, it's not entirely your normal coast, because we have sea ice that comes and scours and scrapes everything away every year. So it has to be deep enough. The life doesn't really start deep enough until it's past the scour point, until it's past the point where the sea ice tumbles everything around. And so there's some things that we kind of expect to see down there. There's lots of bare rock down there. We've got lots of kelp. We've got brown kelp, red seaweed, things like that. And when we actually get down there with some cameras, we get to see some really beautiful things. It is extremely colorful down there, right? So about 20% of that area when they were doing those transects was that kind of bare rock. And so that means we have a lot of photosynthesizers that are just in the water column, right? But then, a lot of it again is that brown kelp. So we're seeing about 20% of that in those reds and orange and hues. And some of it's crustose, or it's encrusted. So it just kind of forms across the rock, and some of it then grows up, right? Depending on where you're from, you're used to seeing different species in different ways. And, right, and then we have lots of different benthic invertebrates. Or sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So we're looking at some of those kelp, and whether the dominant species are the ones that grow up, more like what you think about like a plant, or whether they crust along the rock, it has to do with the relationship between nutrients and light. So if there's more nutrients, often we have the ones that grow up like a plant. And if it's nutrient limited and has an excess of light, we often get the ones that are crusting on the rock. So you can see how the balance plays in. And again, where do those nutrients come from? They came from the rivers. Now, the light, I'm running a little low on time. Almost there. We're going to get there. So why are all of these going to be, why are we seeing these color spectrums, right? And where's the other colors? So we're seeing, let's go back for a second, a lot of reds and oranges. And so it has to do with how far light can travel into the ocean. It decides which rays get down there. But if you tack on the fact that we have sea ice going in there, so it's almost like it's deeper sooner, you can think about it that way. But the drive home is just that different rays of light travel differently in the visible spectrum, and then get absorbed differently in different pigments. So both in the summertime when they have nearly all daylight, and we have that deeper water column, the only light wave that makes it down there is on that blue-violet spectrum, which is really high energy actually. And so different kelp, they employ what's called carotenoids. That should sound familiar, carotenoid, which is oranges and red, to be able to both uptake that energy and also kind of keep them from getting a sunburn. So that's how come everything underneath there kind of has that orangey hue sort of rays. And then here we've got, I'm zooming through this and I'm looking at the wrong clock. Never mind, I don't have to worry about it. We're good. I was stressing about time. Okay, so here we have the invertebrates now. This is what I was waiting to get to. These are the invertebrates that we could expect to see on the bottom of the ocean. And the most common one is actually a sea snail when they were doing this. So that in B, that top right there, those were the most common little guys hanging on the bottom. The next was both chitons and limpets. So if you look in the top left, if you look in A, the one that kind of looks more like a mountain, that's a limpet. If you're not an ocean person, I'm trying to just, whereas this is a chiton. Both of them are, limpets have, it's like a one-sided, kind of like a scallop, like a one-sided shell sort of thing going on. And then our chiton over there, it's almost like little armor chinks that go together, but both of them can kind of like, they graze along the rocks and they filter feed along the bottom. And these are little guys, but again, if you remember what I was talking about before, which is that belugas are bottom feeders. So these are some of their food, right? Again, we often think about them going after a larger prey because they're a larger whale, but they do comb the bottom, just like this walrus is doing here in this picture. And they'll suck up snails and sandworms, not just sand. They do get a little bit of sand. So they suck up a lot of those little things. So that is a food source for them, right? Important to keep in mind. So that's kind of what we learned from the transects, from the scuba diving transects. Now let's talk about what we learned from the eDNA. And this is what's so cool, right? All they had to do was they went and filtered water. They got 60 liters of water, filtered it out. They looked for their gene markers, and they were able to identify 22 vertebrates, 50 different invertebrates, and 8 different types of seaweed from essentially a big old bucket of water. How cool is that? No. Excuse me. When we look at the vertebrates, the ones that they found through eDNA, when they're doing that, the biggest one was capelin. So that's one of the school fish that's really, really important. It's probably the primary diet of most of our whales here in Hudson's Bay. Again, so that pod lifestyle, able to hunt them. And so the top, you can see a school of them swimming by, and then the bottom, you actually get a nice side profile of one. It's nice to sort of be able to put a face to the name when we're talking about things like this. And then, so that was about 62% of the DNA that they were finding. And then the next one, again, this is a sign that we know they were there in the summertime, 27% of the DNA they were finding actually came from belugas, right? So again, the researchers did see them around in the area. They saw a few different pods. They even actually saw one pod hunting these guys, which is pretty cool. But on their transects, right, you never see that. And so you can't technically record it. And so that's what's really cool, be able to tie this together and to see that the dominant prey source, is so closely linked with the dominant predator there as our belugas. Some of the other fish this is how they hunt them. That's what I wanted to say before I moved on. So what they're doing, and again, sorry, this is for seals because getting an image of belugas hunting is really hard to try and find. Life goal, if anyone wants to send anyone. But what they do is they create something that's often called a bait ball if you're working with larger whales or seals. And so they kind of push them up, and they'll push them really close to shore in a shallow area, giving them not very much space to go. And then they'll kind of tuck in, and each one will try and grab a mouthful after working together as a team. All right, so we know that we've got capelin, we've got belugas. Also from that eDNA, we get to see some other fish that, again, you might not even be able to record. So they have sand lances. Those guys live in the bottom. Pretty cute. Long-nosed suckers, which are bottom feeders. And then Arctic char, which are a cousin of our salmon, right? So again, a really big proponent or component of the Arctic food web that we're able to monitor here. On the marine mammal side of things, again, someone that they saw but wasn't in a transect, they were able to capture with eDNA was the ring seal. So the ring seals are the most populous across all of the Arctic, and they do make Hudson's Bay their home. And so it would make sense that we'd find them here. They're also eating on a lot of similar foods as the beluga whales are. What is super, super cool about this study when they're doing the DNA is that there was one more marine mammal that they did not expect whose DNA showed up, which was an orca. Yeah. So prior to about the mid-1900s, orcas were not known to be present in the Hudson's Bay. And then as we've had sea ice loss and that stayed open longer, they've sort of been these cryptic hunters that come in and out. And so periodically locals do see them. They're like, yeah, we see them every now and again. It does happen. But like actually getting recording them in the environment and getting it at time, right? So we know that within a handful of days, there was an orca that had been trying to hanging out, probably going after some seals, probably going after those belugas. So pretty wild to see. And this is all what they're learning sort of subsurface. On the surface side, if you and I are to go wander up there, I'll be going up there in first week of August. Who would we actually be seeing, right? We're not at Natural Habitat. We're not going scuba diving. I wish we were, but different trip, different location. Have to go for that one. Who are we going to be seeing? You're going to definitely be seeing some belugas up there and so much wildlife, right? It's one of the sort of meccas if you're a birder, from being able to see different ones. So at the top there, you're looking at an Arctic tern, a Jaeger, of course, our classic Canadian geese you can find everywhere and anywhere. The bottom E there is a godwit, and then F, you've got some widgeons hanging out. This place is teeming with life. Again, it's all for the same reason. The Arctic just comes alive. It's a short summer, but man, is it productive. And that's why all of these creatures are traveling there to store up, get all nice and fat, raise the young, and then head back south, right? Now, the birds are heading south, but when we see the whales, we're seeing them on the most southern point of their migration. They're all heading north. They are heading out of here. And the reason is again because of that sea ice. So they don't want to get trapped in the bay. The bay is not like one solid sheet of ice once winter flows, but it doesn't have reliable breathing holes for them. So they come down here. You look in the black. It says summer core area. You can see the different rivers tucked in. Here's Churchill on the very, very far left. Right, so that's where they're coming to summer, but they migrate in, have their calves, they molt, spend chat on some capelin and have some good times. But then as the weather starts to turn and get colder again, these herds are all going to migrate north. And then they'll actually join into larger pods in this sort of top area here. It's a social winter time, which is nice, play cards or whatever it is the whale equivalent is of passing away the winter. And so we're catching them sort of just at that end of their cycle, of their migratory cycle. In Churchill River itself, so where we can expect to find them is really in along the deepest part of that channel. Again, in the same way that we have really long tides, or should say we have really shallow slopes up on Hudson's Bay. So it just means that when the tide goes in and out, it covers quite a bit of distance. And we have the same thing in the tidal plains in the mouth of the river here in the estuary. And so it's very rare that you'll find the belugas sort of in along the edge. You'd really just find them in that deepest part because it's the safest place to be for them in that regard. And then also where they are sort of upstream the river fluctuates with the tide. So high tide, they move up river a little more. At low tide, they all shift back down because they don't want to get stuck, right? Not a good time getting stuck there. And so for us here in Churchill, we usually have a few thousand whales come visit us every summer, or not visit us, visit the river. We just so happen to be there. Very grateful for it. But there are tens of thousands that come and do this migration all along the west coast of Hudson's Bay. So I said before, a lot of this study was, looking to see there was all these sort of indigenous-led conservation and different communities all along the coast here. And so different parts of it are at different phases of making that a reality, which is pretty freaking cool to see. So this is showing you from the Mushkegowuk Council that they are so they've signed a memorandum of understanding with the Canadian government, and they're assessing what is essentially the bottom third of Western Hudson's Bay, so kind of halfway, I should say southwestern. They've got part of James Bay here and then the southern part, and then Churchill will be a little further up. So for context, this actually overlaps with like the Ontario part of the Hudson's Bay. The Manitoba side, so like Churchill and all of our folks up there are also in the same negotiations, just at a different phase of this. But yeah, this is a really amazing example of people, local people who were taking action and trying to, choose a path for how they wanted their future to look. Right, so if this gets instated, things that this can protect from, there'll be no resource extraction, there'll be no use of bottom trawlers, there'll be no disposal of waste, anything like that, to name only a few. And so it's a trudge, right? I'm telling you this was from 2001 and they're still going and it's still a conversation, right? But locally, it does make a big, big difference when you can take time and funnel some of that life energy that you have into something that matters. So with that, I will bring her to a close and I will pass it back to you, Rob.
All right, Kristina, thank you so much. Now, before we dive into the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit questions via the question field in your control panel. So that's in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You click on those three lines there. That's called the hamburger. Open up that hamburger, and you'll see all the toppings in there, including questions. Go ahead and click on questions and submit your questions in there, and we will get to them. So let's get to some of these questions. So since belugas don't head south, what do they eat in the winter?
Yeah, they're still feeding on essentially all the same things. They're just doing it in a different region. So as they move into different sections, it'll be other school fish like herring, Arctic cod, even Arctic char, that other fish that I showed you. So they'll go after some of those. And again, they're eating things like clams, mussels. So like the distribution is different depending on which part of the bay you're in. So as they go more into Hudson Strait, there's more mussels and things like that there, right? So you can have shifting diet depending on where they're going, or just shifting prey sources, is whether it's bottom feeding or whether it's mid-water column. Um, Males, as a kind of a fun aside, so in general, females don't dive as deep, and again, is usually because they have calves and things like that. But males will dive much deeper, and they will go for things like squid and octopus, like quite deep down, like 600 meters. So what are we looking at there? Like 900 or no, times three, like 1800 feet, things like that. So pretty deep, and they'll go down for different food sources. So it just kind of depends on like age, sex, sort of life phase, and that's so within the migratory route of what they'll be feeding on.
Gotcha, thanks. And so if I'm coming out there on a NatHab trip, uh, is there a specific time of year that I should be targeting if I want to make sure I see belugas?
Yeah, I would say that it's pretty dialed. So we run our trip starting, when's the first one? Second or ish, second-ish week of July into not into it's about a month or maybe 6 weeks from roughly mid-July to or early July to middle of August, give or take a little bit. Um, and we're doing that when like the main pods are there. There are already pods there on either end. So I would not worry about whether or not you're going to see a beluga whale. If you are thinking about joining us for one of our summer trips, something you can factor in if this is important to you. If you're just going for whales, then don't even worry about it. But if you're hoping to maybe snag the opportunity of seeing a polar bear at the same time, then I would suggest going slightly later in our season, just because there's always a chance of seeing a bear. Usually, like you might see one would be kind of the thing, or maybe two that are sort of in the area. We always go look for them and we keep that in mind. But the later you go in, if you want to try and have that double down of I saw a polar bear on my beluga trip, then you'd want to go later. That's the only kind of advice I'd give around that one.
Gotcha, thank you. So there are polar bears in the area. How do they factor into this ecosystem?
Yeah, that is a great question. So they are an apex predator. They're a marine one, right? So they do and actively hunt belugas, less so in the summertime. And the same reason why they're fasting, why their main prey source is not available in the summertime, which is seals, is that they're really dependent on the other marine mammals that they hunt coming up to breathing holes. And in the summertime, just imagine it's like a game of whack-a-mole. In the wintertime, the holes get smaller and narrower, and you only have so many places to go. In the summertime, they can come up anywhere. And so they have to change hunting strategies, and often most of our bears are fasting. So if they could get a whale, they would. It's extremely rare, even in the wintertime, to be honest, just because of the size difference, and it's very opportunistic. Like they can't really plan to hunt a beluga. It's more so they come across a beluga who is stuck at a breathing hole and they can't get away. So like the next breathing hole is closed up, and so they can't dive far enough to get to the next one. So they're stuck breathing in the one spot. And then a bear will essentially sort of continue to attack and harass that beluga until it runs out of breath, and then they can pull it out. So that's their interaction. We can have a whole other webinar on the human bear interaction in Churchill if we wanted to.
So comparatively, how big is a polar bear compared to a beluga?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So belugas are bigger. Belugas clock in around 3,500 pounds for a male, and then maybe around 32 or 31 for a female. Females around 80% of a male's weight. So again, whether you're full adult or not, and the health of your body, things like that. Whereas polar bears, again, depending on time of year, because they do just do such large weight gains and losses throughout the year. But let's say like a polar bear at its chunkiest, like a big polar bear is about, 1,600 pounds. A record breaker would be an 1,800, right? Like as we get to that, there are a few that have been recorded at 2,000, but those are exceptionally large. So the belugas have the weight advantage, but they don't have, there is no, there is no fight response, right? Like if a bear can kind of hook into them and pry them out, then there's no thing like they can kind of worm back, but that's it, right? So and it's kind of factors into how polar bears hunt in general. Like most of their prey doesn't fight back. There's between fight or flight, all of their prey leans into flight, and so that's how their hunting strategies have also evolved.
Great, thank you for that answer. So are we worried about the beluga, or is the population declining?
Yeah. Oh, this is something that comes up with not every Arctic species, but a lot of Arctic species, and I it's the generation, it's the time that I'm at. And so I can tell people that in general, no, the population is not declining. However, if you were in part one, or if you kind of remember a bit of what I was talking about at the beginning, the average body size of a lot of our Arctic species is going down. It means that they are smaller, they have to spend more energy to hunt, and so their reproductive capacity is going down. Kind of like the margin of error of their survival is getting smaller. And so we're sort of sitting in this window of time before the tipping point where, again, some populations are going up, some are like subpopulations are going down as a general rule of thumb, but as a or specifically, sorry, and then as a general rule of thumb, all of our species, they're getting a narrower and narrower window of survival. And so I can't tell you, and again, this is maybe pessimistic of me a little bit, but it's like, how close are we going to get to the edge where we suddenly, cross the threshold and we start seeing huge population drops? I don't know. And again, change will be diverse for different subpopulations. But their body conditions. So that's short answer is their populations are relatively stable. Their body conditions are declining.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. Just going back to the trip for a second, how many people are on a single beluga trip with me when we're going out there?
Yeah, so that depends if you choose to join us for a photo expedition or for a naturalist expedition. Obviously, both contain elements of both, but they are designed differently in pace and a few of activities. So these days, photo trips run 12, I believe. Ooh, maybe 12 to 14. I think it's 12. And then our naturalist ones are usually 15 or 16 people. Um, But again, like the zodiacs, the kayaks, all of it's set up so that you've got lots of space. And honestly, it's a really nice number, even from a guiding side of things. Like you have the space and time to get to know everybody. You have time to sort of visit with different folks, but it's not an overwhelming amount of people. Um, yeah. So either way, if you were looking at a trip, either it'll be great. The photo one is
Gotcha.
different because you're spending like it's fewer people, and you're kind of getting a bit more techie with stuff. So the idea is like that's the logic of where some of that time is going is your guides are slowing down and giving you that more one-on-one time for some really advancement in your skills. Or if you're already a photo pro, just advancement to have the time in places longer is another argument for it.
Gotcha. Thank you. So let's go back to beluga and their body sizes again. Do we know why they are declining? You talked about an increase of nutrients and runoff. Um, does that not affect
Yeah.
them at all?
So it's not so that's not the part of like the body decline is because their prey sources are changing and so they're um part of what's happening. So it's as sea ice retreats and things get warmer, we also have like some other species coming up, and so we call it like Atlantification is one way to talk about it. But essentially, it's just characteristics of southern oceans are moving further north, and so with those, you're getting both like the species that are there have less fat on their body, and you're getting species that fat is like the currency of the Arctic, and so essentially belugas are eating prey with a lower fat content, and so they have to hunt more of it or eat more of it to get the same intake that they need. So they have to expend more energy to get to the same level. And so, um, like when I was talking about how we don't know which way the scales are tipping, it's like, yes, there's more primary productivity, but the relationship between those is changing. And so we essentially think that it's climate change driven. Their habitat is changing, their food source is changing, they're getting a little smaller, and then because they're smaller, they can't dive as deep, and then it's a loop because their food. This is another thing I didn't quite talk about because Hudson Bay is quite shallow, but depending on which subpopulation of belugas we're talking about, some of their prey is hanging out at like 900 to again that like 1200 1300 feet deep, and so they have to dive if they are deep divers. So they're actually like because they can't dive for as long, they're losing windows to that awesome level where the prey is at, and so they have to pick off of less abundant sources. So that's yeah, it's not a universal like everywhere in the Arctic. This is why we think their body's declining, but where we see it, those are our best guesses as to how things are playing out.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. So with belugas and polar bears, is what can we do to help the situation? Is there anything that you could recommend that we can do from here?
Yeah, that is always such a great question. I think one part of it is part of what you're even just doing right now. Get informed. really understand and getting people to understand that like there isn't a substitute for some of these places, right? When we talk about like belugas are ice dependent. This is the world they live in. There's not somewhere else to go to, right? And so that shifting world and understanding that their ecology is so tied to place. So I think that's honestly always the best step for all of that. There is, again, getting aware of some of these marine conservation areas. So I mentioned one that's forming along Hudson's Bay, but the Arctic is about to become, is already becoming, some of the most, whatever, I'll just say it, like politically controversial place. Everyone is staking claims to the Arctic. As the Arctic gets easier to access, every country says, no, this is mine, no, this is mine. And so it is changing. Shipping routes are going to open up. Who belongs to what? There's huge pushes. They're already trying to put in bids for owning different sections under the sea that are not going to be open for 50 or 100 years in anticipation of oil and gas, right? So the problem with the Arctic is that it's out of sight, out of mind. So if you can, uh, you know, whichever country you're tuning in from, I'm assuming most of you guys are from the States, but I'm just going to ask a question. Like, do you know the extent of the US's claims? Do you know how it's handling policies of that? Get educated on that side of things, right? Because while we live a southern life, and trust me, anyone, doesn't matter where you live in the States, if you're not from the high Arctic, they call everyone southern, right? A lot of what we live off of comes from these faraway places. We don't see the price it pays. So, you know, learn the price of what your lifestyle pays. I think that's the first one, and where it's coming from, and then decide if you're still willing to pay it, right? Again, talking about local, maybe you can resource more things local. Like again, that's a basic one, but I think that if we, this, I kind of showed you an example of this community here. Whoops, let's go back one. Trying to do some good work, right? So if I'm telling you that some of the things are at the expense of this community that's trying so hard to save it, if you don't know that, you don't know that it's costing someone else something. And so that's really, I think that's the biggest thing for faraway places, whether it's, rainforests and jungles or whether it's the Arctic, it's the same thing. You really got to know where our resources are coming from, and then make good choices about it. That's my request for everyone today.
Thank you for that, Kristina. Unfortunately, that is going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you for your closing comments.
Sweet. Well, thank you, Rob, as always, and thank you everyone for tuning in. This is, just really enjoy getting to do this. I appreciate that my work, I feel like, gets to have impact and roll through so many ways. I am going to do a part 3, so please come back. I'm going to do it just before I take off for beluga season this year. So I believe my next one is July 23rd. If you want to finish our epic, our story of belugas and different aspects of their life, I would love for you to join me then. But otherwise, take care, and I will pass it back to you, Rob.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristina. As our friend Mary Gershinoff said, we're so glad to have you back, Kristina. We always learn so much, and we even enjoy your rants.
Oh, that's good. Thanks. Thanks, Mary. Amazing.
I thought you'd get a kick out of that.
That was perfect. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us today. So if you are interested in information on how you can see belugas with natural habitat, please give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including our registration links, on the website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.